Well, so in regards to the engineer capitalist, in your opinion, how might the spirit of engineer capitalist be brought back to the United States? Do you think it's lost?
I think it's lost for some substantial time, but I think, one of the most telling statements in how bizarre American capitalism has become is that chief of Goldman Sachs, who, when he was having his most recent bonus, which is up in the hundreds of million, close to $100 million, being challenged, said he was doing God's work.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry. In a fundamental sense, the financial system is a necessary parasite. You need credit is an essential part of letting normal corporations work. They need working capital to handle their unexpected increase in expenses, to be able to pay their bills as and when they fall due, rather than waiting until they get the cash receipts coming through later. So credit's an essential part of the system at that level, but it is simply a transfer from one component of society to another. It does not produce net wealth.
Right.
Now, when we let the finance economy take over, this is done. Its nickname is the FIRE economy: finance, insurance, and real estate. They are basically people involved in net transfers. And when you have an asset bubble going on, as you've had obviously in America very dramatically in both property and shares, they cream off that increase in capital, in the price of capital assets, with the fees they can charge, because lots of people are the profits that they get out of superannuation, your 401ks and stuff like that, all comes out of that appreciating price level. They cream off that surplus, but they're not producing anything. They're actually undermining the wealth production of the society. And you've got to grasp control from those people once more. They have to be thrown out of the high office that they're in at the moment. And that isn't the sort of thing that happens in one electoral term or inside a considered thing. There has to be a revulsion at that way of behaviour. And of course, the last time around, it took us 20 years to get that point, from 1929 to the late 1940s, with the horror of the Great Depression, the Second World War in the meantime. I hope we have to go through anything quite that bad, but I think you need something which really means there's a visceral reaction against those people, and they just simply get pushed out, like Jesus throwing the moneylenders out of the temple, something of that scale, before you really get back to giving engineers control.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you personally, I can definitely see a shift in the social mood here in the States. It's taking a while, but it is growing. The transfer of wealth and the picking of those that are just too big to fail, the picking and choosing by politicians, it's kind of hard to ignore. And so in regards to these FIRE economy individuals, I noticed that while you were talking to Max Keiser, you'd mentioned that if the USA were to reindustrialize, we would have a lot of these FIRE, finance, insurance, real estate economy players who are non-productive to an industrial economy with no place to fit. And they do not have the skills to be the engineering capitalist. So is part of the solution to encourage engineers perhaps to be the capitalists again? And should we be encouraging them to learn more about economics? And if so, what advice would you have?
Well, they certainly have to learn. They should be trying to take over. They shouldn't be conceding the high ground to the economists and the financiers, definitely. But economics itself is a very, very dangerous area to get into, because it is so badly structured. If engineers ever feel that they read some economics up and think it's mumbo-jumbo and gobbledygook, they are right. The level of training of economists is absolutely appalling. Their mathematical ability is never stretched. It's quite amusing when I have colleagues who have been engineers who then decided to go and do an undergraduate or even a postgraduate course in economics, and they find themselves falling off their chairs in laughter watching it. The professor be really impressed with how he can find the point of intersection of two straight lines. They don't study differential equations. They don't study dynamic systems at all. They have a complete ignorance about this. And for example, I'll give you one of my most favourite examples of this. A guy who's a deputy governor of our equivalent of the Federal Reserve challenged me for my focus on the ratio of debt to GDP in a meeting, on the basis that I was making a big mistake by comparing a stock to a flow. And I was, obviously it's a mistake to treat a stock as a flow or vice versa, and economists do that all the time. A great engineer turned economist called Mikhail Koleski once noted to a leading dissented economist that he discovered what economics was. It was the science of confusing stocks and flows. But obviously the ratio of debt to GDP, the dimensionality of that is the number of years it will take you to pay your debt down. And that's clearly a very important measure of the degree of financial stress the system is under. So you have to, certainly engineers should be involved in learning economics, but they have to rewrite it. I would like to see engineers take over economics again. And on that basis, I would give, not again for the first time, but I think engineering has done far more to analyse dynamic systems than economists have got anywhere near. And really, we should be democratising economics and letting engineering departments teach it, because clearly there's been a failure by the monopoly economists in teaching genuinely realistic economics. So on that basis, the recommendation I'd make to economists, to engineers wanting to study economics is threefold. First of all, don't read any of the conventional textbooks. First of all, read one or two books. One's going to be very hard to get, by a professor of applied mathematics, since deceased in Australia, called John Blatt, B-L-A-T-T. He wrote a brilliant book called Dynamic Economic Systems. And that will give you an engineer's perspective on what's so wrong about conventional economics and what should be some of the ways to build a decent economics from a very, very basic foundation, unfortunately. Secondly, read my book, Debunking Economics. You realise just how appallingly bad the whole area of economics is. I left the mathematics out because I was trying to write for a non-mathematical audience, but any engineer will see the mathematics that lies behind that. And thirdly, look at the work of Mikhail Koleski, who was a Polish economist, a Polish engineer, trained under the Soviet system to some extent, who then moved to England during the Great Depression and reinvented a lot of the intelligent components of Keynes's work in a mathematical format. Now, if you look at the combination of those three, you may get the start of a decent theory. Also, physicists are getting involved in economics now. There's a group calling themselves econophysicists. So I definitely suggest looking at the work that they're doing. But when you put that all together, then you have an engineer's approach to analysing the economy, which is what we desperately need. The fourth person I'll mention is somebody who's mainly famous for something he wishes he'd never done, which is Phillips, who gave us the Phillips curve. You would have heard that being talked about.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, now Phillips is actually an engineer, and a brilliant engineer, and he tried to introduce economists to systems, to flow charts and block diagrams back in the 1950s. And that Phillips curve thing was just a particular nonlinear relationship he thought made sense that would be in actual dynamic feedbacks in a proper dynamic model of the economy. So Phillips's papers from the 1950s will give you an idea of how you could apply systems engineering type thinking to economics.